Yes, we are. Okay. Or I'm not sure. Oh, yes, we are. Oh, well, well, welcome everybody to this new broadcast by Lógica MX. We're very happy to have this event since it's an event celebrating the World Logic Day 2026. We've got a crew of really special guests. I am really thrilled about this. We've got Jessica Wilson, of course, Ole Thomassen, I hope I said it well, and Jonas Arenhart. My name is Gabrielle, and we'll be talking for the next maybe half an hour, couple of hours about very specific things in logic. But first, I would like to ask you guys, how do you feel about World Logic Day? Did you do anything fine, something fun? How has it been? The World Logic Day 2026 for you? Maybe I'll go with Jessica.
Logic Day has been spectacular.
Terrific. What have you done in this 2026 regarding Logic Day?
Well, I'm thinking more about logic,
Yeah,
thanks in part to this opportunity. So it's pretty exciting.
that's terrific.
Hopefully,
Yeah.
it'll continue on in future days.
Well, yes, that's the thing. There's lots of things to do before and after the World Logic Day. Ole, do you have anything special regarding World Logic Day 2026?
Every day is Logic Day for me.
Yeah.
No, um, I, I think it's a great concept. I think everyone can agree that the world needs more logic. So what's wrong with having a Logic Day and people organizing events about logic and especially outreach events about logic? It's a small discipline after all, and we need to do everything we can to recruit people and make sure there's interest in our field. So I think that's wonderful.
Yes, that's interesting because you would think that we could take for granted that logic is important, but on the other hand, we've got lots of work to do, like promoting logic. It's paradoxical, I guess. Jonas, did you have anything special to report regarding World Logic Day 2026? Your
And
microphone.
Ole?
There you go.
Yes, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, good. I can't agree more with Jessica and Ole. It is a very special day and an important date for us to celebrate. In particular, during the actual Logic Day, which was, I think, January 14th, no? I was traveling and taking part on a conference in philosophy of science, but this is also related to the topic of today. And so, yeah, I think every day is a good day to think about logic and keep the work going.
Yes, most definitely. So, I guess this is a very special World Logic Day for Lógica MX, since we had a couple of events, being this one the second, and especially, oh God, the cats are behaving like hooligans. I hope they stop. I wish they didn't. Well, our event today is called Logic Within the Sciences. So it's a great topic, really important, since often people would wonder what has logic to do with everyday people's concerns. So we've got some questions that we'll be discussing for the next few minutes, and well, we've got. The thing is this. There are philosophical debates about the nature of logic repeatedly returning to the relation with the sciences, whether as a foundation for scientific reasoning, as something informed by scientific practice, or as standing apart from it. How do you each conceive this relation, and why do you think it continues to play such a central role in debates about what logic is and how we know its truths? The question is, how do you each understand the relation between logic and sciences? I don't know. Would you like to start, Jessica?
Yes, thank you, Gabrielle. Well, I think this is a great question, and it really multiplies into several questions, different answers. If you're just asking in general, what's the relation between logic and the sciences? So one quick answer might be just to say that logic is itself a science. So it's the science of broadly valid reasoning. Such investigations, broadly scientific investigations into logic might aim to figure out what valid reasoning more specifically is, or what the ground of such reasoning might be, sentential structure or something else. Relatedly, perhaps whether there's more than one kind of validity, and so on. So from that perspective, logic just is a science. Among other sciences, it's a branch of epistemology, maybe, something like that. But in this context, what you're probably asking is more specifically whether logic shares certain features of the broadly natural or empirical sciences. So again, there's many questions that are interesting and relevant here. So you might ask whether logical theories are justified in the same way as the natural sciences. So most will say that the natural, broadly empirical sciences are justified via something like inference to the best explanation, or for short, abduction. And then the question there sort of generates the dispute between so-called anti-exceptionalists about logic, according to whom logic is justified, logical theories are justified in the same way as scientific theories, that is to say, by way of abduction, or as the exceptionalists might claim, that they are otherwise justified, maybe as a matter of analytic entailment or conceptual analysis, conceiving, etc. So that's one kind of answer, but again, or a question, and then it generates more questions depending on how you answer that question. So if you think that logic is in fact justified via inference to the best explanation, then you might want to ask, moreover, whether it would follow that logic is itself empirical, just in virtue of being justified in that way by abduction, or, either way, whether you think logic is justified by way of abduction or not, you might go on to ask whether there's just one logic, as the monists believe, or many potentially different logical systems, as pluralists believe. So just to register my own inclinations, so a lot of these are, still, my own thoughts on these matters are still under development, but my tendencies are in favor of anti-exceptionalism, and so I think that logical theories are, like scientific theories, justified by abduction, or again, inference to the best explanation. But I, along with my co-author on these topics, Stephen Biggs, we disagree with some who think that it thereby follows, if you are an anti-exceptionalist, you think that logical theories are justified by abduction, it follows that logic is a posteriori just in virtue of being so justified. So we can, distinguish between whether a mode of inference that enters into the justification of a given theory, scientific or logical, has its epistemic value as a matter of sort of contingent ways that the world is or not. And if it, the value of the mode of inference depends on the world's being a certain way, then you might say, oh, well, then that mode of inference is, we could say, a posteriori, or its epistemic value is a posteriori. And many have thought that abduction is like that. Okay, so this is by way of contrast to just this question of whether, if I apply a mode of inference to some empirical data, then my conclusion may be a posteriori. So we can distinguish between whether the mode of inference is itself such that its epistemic value is somehow empirically informed, dependent on contingent goings-on, and is a posteriori in that way. Distinguish the value of the mode of inference from whether the mode of inference operates on some empirical data or not. So those are, two routes to an a posteriori conclusion. And the anti-exceptionalists typically have thought that if logic is justified by way of abduction, then logical theories, logical claims are a posteriori, kind of independent of whether the data that they operate on is a priori, just in virtue of abduction having being such that its epistemic value is a posteriori. But Stephen Biggs and I argue that, in fact, abduction is contrary to, a common assumption, is an a priori mode of inference, again, that such that its epistemic value is a priori, not a posteriori, which, again, is compatible with, with abduction operating on a posteriori data. So then, to finish up, sorry, went on a bit too long there, but then the question about whether that has been of interest to me is whether, if you are an anti-exceptionalist, whether it would follow that logical theories are themselves a posteriori or not. And there we say, well, it depends. It depends on whether, not on abduction, not on abduction alone doesn't decide whether logic is a posteriori. It depends on whether the abductive inference, operates on a posteriori data, and people can disagree about that. So that's a kind of sequence of questions that I thought might be useful to kind of raise to salience about how all the different ways in which logic and the sciences might bear upon each other and how they generate certain of these very common debates in the philosophy of logic.
Yeah, yes, most definitely. I think it's fascinating. I've got just a remark to do. Philosophy students are usually very keen on debating Immanuel Kant and, oh yes, this is a priori, a posteriori, and then they don't feel very keen on studying logic regarding that topic. It's really puzzling for me. It's like, why don't you care about this? Well, whatever. Then, Ole, do you think you have... would you like to tell us how do you understand the relation between logic and sciences? And if, of course, if you've got any remark on what Jessica just said, you can just go ahead.
Yeah, I think Jessica did a terrific job in spelling out some of the connections. And at least on this topic, I can't hide behind not having a view, because I very much have a view. I'm an anti-exceptionalist about logic, and so I think that logical theorizing and theory choice in logic should be informed by our thinking about sciences in general. I think of logic as a science, so that's certainly a tight connection that Jessica, already described. But I think I want to take a step back and get into something else that she mentions, which is that I think it's important to appreciate where we're coming from in this debate, right? So the traditional thinking, very roughly, is that logic has this very privileged position in intellectual inquiry, in the acquisition of knowledge, and in the sciences specifically. And most philosophers have not taken logic and the truths of logic to be empirical. They've taken them to be in some sense, sort of stand apart truths, and that are indispensable to the sciences. And then, if you think that way, you're left with some difficult questions. Okay, so what kind of justification can we have for logical principles, the truths of logic, if they are that different from scientific truths more generally, right? And then a number of philosophers have come in to give what I would characterize as exceptionalist explanations of this, right? And so Jessica talked about the a priori, right? So of course, a priori justification can mean a lot of things, right? But some have argued that logical principles are principles that we can know via some kind of rational intuition, a kind of insight or logical seeing, right? A little bit like akin to how you might think you can see a mathematical truth. And certainly in the 20th century, a very important tradition has been a semanticist tradition, according to which logical truths can be known merely in virtue of possessing certain concepts, logical concepts such as and, or, if, then, and so on. And so you somehow, knowing those concepts or being a competent speaker, you're in a position to know logical laws. Again, a way of acquiring knowledge, in this case about logic, that's very different from the way that we think about acquiring scientific knowledge in general. So the anti-exceptionalist positions, those are by and large a reaction to these traditional views, right? And once you start rejecting views like, oh, logic is a priori in this very direct sense, or logical truths are true in virtue of meaning, or something along those lines, then you're back to a more sort of humdrum questions. Well, if it's not these special kinds of justification, how can we justify the truths of logical laws? And that's kind of the positive anti-exceptionalist project, right? And Jessica said, well, maybe it's abduction, right? Maybe it's a kind of inference to best explanation that we recognize from a lot of other scientific contexts. So that's a start, at least. Thank you.
No, thanks to you, Ole. I think yes, it it comes with a cost. Like saying like, oh no, it does have to do with empirical stuff, but then it's like, well, it has these consequences. It's not easy. Well, Jonas, would you like to add something to what Jessica and Ole said, or just a
Yes.
thought of yours, of
Yes,
course?
I'll be quick
No, don't
because
worry. Take your time.
Jessica did a very nice job in disentangling some of the difficult questions that are present on your formulation, and Ule also mentioned a nice point on the relation between logic and the tradition, which is related to the point that I would like to raise to complement and join the points that they raised, because you mentioned something like whether the relation of logic and science could help us to understand the essence of logic. And I would like to add that maybe logic does not really have an essence, but it has a kind of a changing essence during history. Different understandings of what logic is and how it works have been promoted in different times. And today, in our times, I would like to say that maybe logic is a science. It is a mathematical science. And what we do when we do logic in philosophy is basically to apply some mathematical formalism to the study of inferences, which brings me to the point of Jessica and Uli. So what we are doing is, in a certain sense, similar, I would say, to working with applied logics, and that makes, applied logics and applied mathematics, because what worries me with this is not only that, of course, this is very interesting, but this makes the focus for us very much on the epistemology of logic and related to logical theory choice. But still, I think that this somehow neglects a little bit the other dimensions of logic, like pure logical theorizing. I believe that we have a lot of knowledge about logic that is not related to just logical theory choice. And in a certain sense, the focus on whether logic relates with empirical science somehow obliges us to focus on just one single problem. So I would like to see anti-exceptionalism as a broader program, encompassing also the epistemology of pure logic, which is related to pure mathematics. So in a sense, I think that anti-exceptionalism would do a nice job if it could also embrace this more general nature of logic as a mathematical theory that gets applied to some different phenomena, and valid inference is one of them. But it's not the only one. And when you see the debates about choosing a logical theory and the wide disagreement about that, you may think that we don't know what is valid. And we, in the end, know nothing about logic. But we do know a lot of things about logic. And I think that it is important to recognize that and to bring all of that also to the debate on anti-exceptionalism. So in short, I would say that I would put that logic is a science, is a mathematical science, and that dealing with inferences is applying this formalism. It's a very important application, of course, I submit. But it somehow makes us focus on only one dimension of logic. So I would suggest that anti-exceptionalism be open to more, to a wider, our wider use and knowledge of logic. That's what I would like to bring to the table.
Terrific. Thank you, Jonas. Would you like to, Jessica, Ole, would you like to add anything to what you've just discussed? Or?
I think Jonas has a very good point, and I absolutely agree with that. That there's a sense in which the discussion about theory, choice, and logic is mostly about philosophical logic, right? It's about the kind of disagreements that we've had about the extension of validity, what are the valid principles, and about the nature of validity, right? What is it for an argument to be valid or for a truth to be a logical truth? But of course, all of the mathematical logic that went into the 20th century with its great results is clearly a part of logic as well, and not all of it can be sort of accounted for in a disagreement about validity. So there are definitely other things going on. Some of it I just think is mathematics, very great mathematics applicable to all sorts of things, right? Some of it is a kind of broadening of the mandate. It's not about validity, but maybe it's about common knowledge or other epistemic and cognitive phenomena that logicians are also interested in, where we recognize that we can use the same formal tools on these phenomena. But I think it's important to distinguish here between the theories and the theory selection and mathematical tools and models, both formal and non-formal, that can be applied to things. And I think logic, in a very broad sense, it includes both of those things.
Yeah.
Yes, Jessica?
Yeah, good. I agree. And I guess I would just add that if one is an anti-exceptionalist, and granting that the focus in that particular debate has been on, or often been on, whether sort of empirical results from the sciences should be informing which logical theories we accept, at least as I think those of us who do think that the justification of any logical theory proceeds abductively could make room for logical theories that do not have any clear empirical application, or more generally see inference to the best explanation as a general epistemological tool for arriving at logical theories as well as other broadly mathematical theories. That's at least how I'm inclined to think of it, because I really do think that abduction is the kind of the boss, so to speak, of the forms of inference. And so, there's no in principle reason to think that one couldn't extend these considerations to the case of pure logic. That's how I would think of it.
Yes, there's lots of things to consider about the forms of inference, and regarding to do with one topic traditionally associated to logic, which would be rationality, and that would explain why you, Jessica, would consider the boss of the inference forms. But well, we can keep discussing on that with the following questions. Now I'll go with Ole, then Jonas, and then Jessica. We're going to the methodological and epistemological questions. Here's the thing. Debates about the nature of logic often appeal to considerations about our inferential practices, cognitive limitations, or the role of logic in scientific reasoning. How tightly should our methodology for studying logic be tied to these cognitive and scientific practices? Is there a risk of that focusing too heavily on how we reason in practice obscures the question of what logic is, or are such practices indispensable for understanding its epistemology and its nature? So, Ole, what would you say to that?
It's a difficult question, I guess, to answer. Definitely. So I think as an anti-exceptionalist, the main aim of logical theorizing is to establish what the true logical principles are, what follows from those, to understand the logical properties such as validity and consistency and provability and so on. And I think there's no necessary connection between those answers that are, answers about, questions about logical properties and practices of reasoning in sciences or elsewhere, right? I mean, the issue is that the practices are, known to be very, very flawed, right? I mean, everything we know about human reasoning abilities, it tells us that we're pretty bad at drawing inferences, right? And we can create theories about how human reasoning works, sort of roughly speaking, models about our reasoning cognitive module, if there is such a thing. And that's an empirical task, right? We work on the basis of data from experimental psychology and so on. And we can do a similar exercise in the sciences and in mathematics, and we can look at how we actually reason, map out the practices, and but still, of course, the philosophical answers to these questions might be, the practices are just misguided, right? The practices are not tracking truth. We're drawing inferences that are not truth preserving. We have methods that are not reliably leading us to the truth. That might very well be. So that's one sort of principal part of the answer, right? But then on the other hand, if you think, well, look, what do we have to go on in order to build the theory of logic? It's very clear that in practical terms, what we've done as philosophers and as logicians is that we've looked to the best practices, or what we consider the best practices. And here, the number one example is mathematics, right? So the 20th century, late 19th century era of mathematical logic started with this kind of exercise of investigating the practice of mathematical proving, right? What are the kind of structures that mathematicians consider proofs, and then extracting structures from that, and then trying to codify that or formalize that with very sort of sparse resources. And it's extremely elegant, right? This is the time of many of the major advances of logic as we know them today. And they were in some sense informed by practices, right? But then you might in addition say, well, look, in the end, we come up with theories based on these practices as part of our evidence, but that could also end up correcting the practice, right? Today we have this enormous richness of different logics. They disagree about various things, right? And for some specific types of inferences, we don't really agree on the answer yet. So yeah, so practice might end up changing.
Yes, of course, it would make a difference. There's stuff to consider. Jonas, what would you like to add to what Ole just said, or the original question, of course?
Yes, thanks a lot. I would say that practice, the focus on practice is good for logicians. Continuing from my previous answer, saying that logic is a kind of use of mathematical theories. This focus on practice, and as Uli mentioned, there is a variety of creation of theories to model different aspects of the practice, and we can't agree about whether all of these theories are really capturing the truth. This instantiates that logical theorizing is maybe interesting by itself. When we create these theories that are trying to describe different aspects of the practice, I could mention like paraconsistent set theory that has a paraconsistent logic underlying it, or these different logics that account for contradictions in many different ways. They do, in a certain sense, illuminate us on how logic works. I would say that we don't need to wait for the final choice of the correct theory for us to have a good idea of how logic works and on different dimensions of logic and the epistemology of logic. I would say that we gain knowledge by doing this. So in a sense, the practice is very enlightening and very useful. As I mentioned before, the problem with this is this focus on whether some theory has gotten it right and how do we choose the right theory for something. As Uli mentioned, this is a very difficult question. Of course, whenever we have two options, philosophers are eager to check which one is the right one, and a whole debate is born on that. So I would say that we lose part of the interest of logic, that is our ability to construct those systems, to build those mathematical models, and learn from that by itself without having to know which one is right. So we get a lot of knowledge from logic, even without entering into these disputes about logical theory choice. So if I may comment a little bit on Uli's mention of the rise of classical mathematics, which was oriented by the practice of mathematicians, like the Russell and Frege paradigm. I would add, if I may, that this project was, at least as I see, very much more a kind of reconstruction of what mathematicians were doing. So Frege, Dedekind, Russell, they were sort of puzzled by the lack of rigor of their fellow mathematicians. And in a sense, they had to, as Uli mentioned, they did not have much data. They had to create a lot of things. So I would say that this was, in an interesting sense, a kind of rational reconstruction that established, as Uli mentioned, new standards. So once you have these systems and they are accepted as interesting and setting a standard, then the game changes and we have a new standard of rigor. So I would say that their pioneer work sort of created a new understanding of mathematical rigor and of rigor in reasoning in general. So very interesting remarks by Uli. And I would complement them by stressing the fact that they had very little data to work on. Or they had the results. They needed to know how to get there with the mathematical basis they were creating. So yeah, the practice was important in this case. And once the new standard is set, we can now play with this and create the most weird systems by toying with this new standard. So that's what I would add.
Yes, of course, it would be complicated because there's too much to jeopardize, I guess, picking one thing or another. Jessica, would you like to add something regarding to what Older and Jonas said, or the original questions, of course, or the relation between logic and epistemology?
Yes, okay. Well, I think my perspective on this question and how I would like to answer it is it really departs maybe a fair bit from Jonas's. I think of course, there's room to allow 1,000 different flowers to bloom, but just with respect to a kind of way that I think about it, which I think I share with some anyway, is that logic in the first instance is targeting the possibility of systematizing what we take to be good or broadly valid reasoning. And, it can be more or less formalized and so on. There's different ways to approach this question. But with respect to the question of whether attention to cognitive limitations or scientific practice and so on should bear upon our investigations into the nature of logic, for example, or the nature of validity, as we might try to systematize it as entering into correct or broadly valid reasoning, I do think there's kind of a really interesting joint in how people approach this question, and certainly along one of the one fork in this road, scientific practice and cognitive limitations turn out to be very important indeed. So to give you a sense of what I have in mind, can go back to how we usually are introduced to the notion of logical validity as involving some kind of necessary truth preservation. So given the truth of the premises, then in some strong sense, you're guaranteed the truth of the conclusion. And, that's a natural way to think about, one form of valid reasoning. But what it does, I think, is it encourages thinking of logic as somehow tracking objective entailment relations between propositions or states of affairs or their propositional correlates, and granting that there is certainly room for one or more such worldly conceptions of logic, such an understanding of validity isn't going to be suited for making sense of how creatures like us, who are frequently operating under circumstances of limited knowledge or uncertainty or cognitive limitations or other epistemically salient factors, do reason or should reason. So what I like about scientific, attention to scientific practice, it seems to me relevant to figuring out or entering into our understanding of logic. Attention to scientific practice and reasoning really makes this explicit, this dependence explicit, because in scientific context, we are typically operating under conditions of uncertainty or, for example, imprecision in one's measurements as either an epistemic or even a metaphysical matter. So in those cases, how should good reasoning proceed? And I would like it, I would hope that our investigations into logic would be able to give us some guidance in those cases. So here I will follow up on Ole's observation that you don't have to take the practices at face value. You can see them as input into thinking about how to refine our reasoning under certain, conditions, which may be epistemically unfortunate, or they might just be metaphysically novel, and so on. So, in general, I think that attending to those cases opens up a new way of thinking about logical validity as not really about sort of joints in nature, but rather about constraints on belief. I like that sort of view. And my husband, Ben Shelley, maybe I'm influenced by my husband, Ben Shelley, who's working out what he calls logical mentalism, which really takes this seriously, the idea that logic is about reasoning from one mental stance to another. So, yeah, as opposed to, so I think this question that you've just asked, one thing it does is it kind of opens up the possibility of thinking about different forms of logical validity, some more along lines of what I think Jonas is attracted to, and others more along lines of something like my husband is attracted to. Right? A little more or less objective, or sort of perspectival in some way.
Yes, most definitely. We at some point would like to think that scientific reason is very different from day-to-day decision making or belief revision, but maybe it is not so different in the end. Well, I'll head to the next question on epistemological things, and we can discuss. Well, now I'll go with Jonas, then Jessica, and then Ole. The question reads, the contemporary landscape of logic includes a wide diversity of classical and non-classical formal systems, many of which are motivated by scientific practice or by limits of idealized reasoning. To what extent should this diversity be taken as informative for the debate between exceptionalists and anti-exceptionalists about logic? Does logical pluralism provide genuine evidence about the epistemic status of logic, or does focusing on diversity risk distracting us from what that debate is really about? Jonas?
Okay, thank you. This is a very interesting, very long and complicated question. Well, I think this continues on the debate from the previous question related to the practice of scientists. And when we say that scientists do reason in contexts that they're facing inconsistency, lack of information and precision, and that logic can benefit from that as a kind of source for logical theorizing, I think I mentioned, I can only agree. People have been doing this, right? There are, if you look at the literature on logic, mostly on philosophical logic, there are many attempts at developing theories that account for diverse examples of inferences drawn by scientists. The favorite examples are the early calculus and the Bohr's model of the atom, which include inconsistencies, and people have been offering many different accounts of how reasoning under those circumstances could go. Another example is what people take to be the naive set theory, where we have Russell set and we don't have triviality. So people have offered different accounts of how to work on those circumstances, and they can be seen as a kind of target, I would say, I would put it in this way, as a kind of target for our logical modeling. So we can offer different models for the same kind of targets, and which for me seems great. Seems like to still continue in your question, this would really help us understand the what we take to be the nature of logic, which on this account that I am suggesting is like a kind of mathematical modeling of inferences. And then, of course, we can take the more lightly or at face value and say, well, we have to model exactly what they are doing, or we can take them less lightly and say, look, some of what they do is good, but some of what they do must be corrected. So we can have a kind of a mixture of descriptive and normative approaches to this logical modeling. And of course, we can judge on whether they are interesting theorizing or not. But I would say that in a certain sense, this is where a lot of epistemic value is already aggregated. So to emphasize what I have already been saying in my previous answers, I don't think we have to wait until logical theory choice comes until we decide which one of those theories is the correct one to see that we have gained a lot of understanding or maybe even knowledge about logic. So that is what makes this idea of logic as a kind of mathematical modeling interesting, at least to me. And of course, it also helps us making sense of the episode of Frege and Russell, as we were commenting before, but also of logics that are not guided by any kind of practice. Because then you can just say, well, what happens if I change negation to behave like this and that? Nobody reasons like this, but still, I want to see if I can have an interesting natural deduction calculus. So it is also part of logical knowledge, right? If you're toying with things and making toy models and trying to approach the wild behavior of logical connectives and quantifiers and all of this apparatus, and then we gain knowledge in a rather similar way by producing these things, by applying techniques that we already know, by trying to answer questions that are standard. Is it decidable? Do we have a nice axiomatic system for that? And so on. So in this sense, the focus on inconsistent or incomplete or sharp science is part of the interesting things that logicians can do when they are doing logic. They are modeling things. They select some targets, some inferences as a kind of focus, and they go on to use the techniques that they know about. But of course, as I'm emphasizing, this should not distract us and lead us to this idea that only when we select the true theory will we have logical knowledge. No, we are already having a lot of understanding and a nice picture of how logic works when we do precisely that. We develop these things. Another quick example, I'm finishing, is theories of truth. When we try to formalize theories of truth, some of them presenting a paraconsistent approach, and some of them allowing that we deduce the paradox, avoiding the liar paradox. So we gain a lot of understanding by building those theories, and that's another quick example of knowledge on the way by doing this. This is what I would answer very shortly, I hope.
Well, yes. Did you, Ole and Jessica, listen to the last bit of what Jonas said? I think there was a bit of interference. It was okay. Okay. Yes, you'd be surprised though, because we would think, oh, well, of course, no one would ever reason like this. But then you find people who do reason like that. It's surprising. Well, then, Jessica, would you like to add anything to what?
Yeah, good. Okay, so just to rehearse the question was whether whether attention to scientific practice or these contexts of where epistemic or other limitations are in place, which then motivate a diversity of classical and non-classical broadly logical systems, would that fact of this diversity as so motivated, right, by the sciences and associated scientific contexts, etc., would that bear on the exceptionalist versus anti-exceptionalist debate? And my question is that, my answer is that I don't see that it would. And in part, I think I'm agreeing with Jonas that, well, first of all, I feel like if you're an anti-exceptionalist, you don't have to see that as committing you to the idea that there's just one true logical theory, even, as regards a specific phenomenon or context or whatever. I hadn't really thought about that as being part of the commitments of an anti-exceptionalist, notwithstanding that, for example, the physicists are going to say, well, there's one true, or they're looking for, hopefully, will find the one true physical theory of the world. And so they are reasoning via abduction, along the way to doing that. But I don't feel like an anti-exceptionalist about logic needs to take on board that idea. They can just extract the mode of inference. I mean, so that's how I was seeing the dispute between the exceptionalists and the anti-exceptionalists, not about whether or not, we've got to use this or that form of reasoning in order to identify the one true logic, but rather just what is the form of justification that's typically operative for any logical theory. Okay. That said, now, if we put that commitment aside, as I think we should, then the anti-exceptionalists can allow that there are diverse logical systems that are operative in different contexts, and the exceptionalists can as well. And I think what the bearing of attention to scientific practice for either of these parties will be, the interesting thing will be they will say, maybe have different stories to tell about the what that attention does. So the anti-exceptionalists might say that, before we thought that the world was a quantum world, we didn't have any reason to formulate or take on board the viability of quantum logic. I mean, that said, I don't think that quantum indeterminacy requires that you depart from classical logic on my account of metaphysical indeterminacy, but, at least some people have thought that was, the science was driving the train there to say, oh, look, you guys you need a quantum logic to make sense of the science. So that's kind of science first approach to the formulation of those logical theories. Whereas an exceptionalist could say, no, look, we have our ways of identifying the diversity of classical and non-classical logical systems, and I can do that via one or other non-abductive, by appeal to one or other non-abductive mode of inference or methodology. And the way I will then describe what attention to science reveals is that some of these guys can now be seen as applying to this or that scientific context. And so, the fact that there are diverse logical systems that are associated with these various scientific contexts wouldn't show itself that anti-exceptionalism is true any more than the fact that we now think that space-time isn't Euclidean would show that theories of geometry are abductively justified. That just seems to be a separate issue. So.
Yes, definitely. Ole, would you like to add something to what Jonas and Jessica said, or the original
It's
question
much harder
itself?
to answer the question when Jessica and Jonas have already said lots of interesting things. But I'm kind of excited now because I think maybe this is the point where we start disagreeing about stuff, and that's good, right? We definitely want that. So I had thought about these questions in a slightly different way, I think. So I'll try to explain what I mean. My reaction to this was that when I compare the situation now with a plethora of logics, classical logic, all these non-classical logics, all their applications, some of them being rivals, some of them are not rivals, and so on. The situation is clearly quite different from the history of logic, right? I mean, if we go back to Aristotle, there is a sense in which logic was canonical for a very, very long time. Of course, there were developments over 2,000 years, but in a still very real sense, Aristotelian logic was taught for 2,000 years as the truths of logic. And they were often considered to be infallible. There was no real discussion about them, right? Yeah, medieval logicians discussed the paradoxes, and there were minor departures. But really, once we reach the later part of the 19th century, there is a kind of revolution, right? And the revolution, we talked a little bit about that earlier. is in part due to the fact that we start mathematizing logic. We use algebraic methods and sort of proto-set theoretic methods. And then logicians and mathematicians started realizing that, hang on a minute, Aristotelian logic cannot really account for all of the patterns of reasoning that we apply in mathematical practice and also beyond mathematics. And so then once we get a more rigorous approach, and in some sense, you know, significantly with Frege, but also earlier than that, then we realize, and Jonas put this very nicely, right, that, oh, wait a minute, we can tinker with all of these things, right? And sometimes it's a little bit like Euclidean versus non-Euclidean geometry, right? We just want to change an axiom and see what happens, and maybe it's fun and maybe it's not, right? And at other times, it's really motivated by a kind of phenomenon out there that we're interested in, vagueness, for instance, right? And then logicians go at it and they try to tinker with the logical theory to get the facts on the ground right. And then we all think that there are some facts that we're trying to get at, although we might disagree a little bit about exactly what the facts are. And I think in this narrative, right, a little bit rough, but anyway, in this narrative, I think there's a very real sense in which anti-exceptionalism, the idea that you need something like inference to the best explanation or mechanisms for theory selection and logic, becomes a real matter, because there are all of these contenders out there. That's a new situation, right? You have all of these theories, some of which are genuine rivals at accounting for the same phenomena. Of course, not all of them, but some of them. And then, someone who's inclined to be an anti-exceptionalist like myself will then think, well, what are these methods, right, that we're going to apply in order to adjudicate between the rival logics. Now, and then there's a sort of period there, right? So there is a connection, I think, between these two things. But pluralism, that's something else, right? Because at least on one formulation of pluralism, that's something along the lines of, there are more than there's more than one correct logic, or two, or at least two logics are equally correct, or something along those lines. Okay, so that I used to be a logical pluralist, by the way, full disclosure, right? But I'm not anymore, and partly because I'm an anti-exceptionalist now, and I think of logical pluralism inside of the anti-exceptionalist agenda as a more radical proposal. It's the proposal, imagine like in biology, that there are two equally correct but incompatible and irreducible theories, right? In science, that's a kind of radical view, right? So you might want to say something like, oh, there are no facts of the matter, right? So there just is no distinguishing between these two theories. They get to be equally correct. Now, I don't think that's the case for logic, right? Of course, I grant that there's all sorts of mathematical tinkering we can do and create models, and that's very interesting. But I think that ultimately philosophers are also interested in, say, the law of excluded middle or the law of non-contradiction, right? If we were to agree, and I know not everyone will, but if we were to agree that those are true principles of logic, in virtue of what are they true, right? And they're not true in virtue of any mathematical model that we cook up, right? I mean, we can simulate them being true in a sense in these mathematical models, right? But if they're genuinely true principles, they're true in virtue of something, right? Maybe it's language, maybe they're true in virtue of linguistic conventions, right? Maybe they're true in virtue of very general features, the structure of the world, right? Which is the Tim Williamson view, Gila Scher, lots of other people. So there are options there, right? But on that account, I think anti-exceptionalism sits a little bit more uneasy with pluralism. So that's what I want to say on the final part. Thank you.
No, thanks to you, Ole. This is this is quite a thing because as a logic teacher, we have to tell our students like there is not one only thing way of thinking of logic. There are many logics. We have to assume that logical pluralism is something important, but then again, then later there's like, oh well, but that can also be challenged. So it really blows people's mind. It's something. It's a great topic to discuss. I don't know, Jonas, do you have something to add regarding to what Jessica and Ole have said about this topic?
I'll make a very quick comment. I hope it does not take too much. I would like to say that I like the idea of a question by John Burgess when he said, well, we are asking whether there is a right logic. And he says, well, right for what? I like this idea of right for what. And Ule mentioned, well, we want to discuss like genuine validity. And as he mentioned, this is probably the point where we have to disagree on some things. And I'm not sure that I think there is some logic describing a notion of genuine validity, but rather different logics describing validities on some fields, perhaps, like validity in classical mathematics, validity in some paraconsistent mathematics. And this notion of validity itself is very much theory laden with the theories that we use to describe them in a certain sense. Because I'm afraid that genuine validity in general is a very wide notion. And in the end, I'm afraid we would find counterexamples to most inferences that we would like to preserve, like excluded middle. We think, well, everyone should like it. But still we find people say, no, here is a context where genuine validity fails. So in a sense, to preserve a nice sense of validity, I would suggest, of course, we will not agree, but I would suggest that we have to say that we want to preserve validity on some context or on some field. So a logic can be right for something, for some aim, for some goal, and not, and probably only validity by itself is a very wide goal that I'm afraid may be very difficult to capture because we can always find some counterexamples. I'm sure Uli has a lot to say about this, but that would be my quick comment on this.
Yes, of course, Jonas. Especially since Maria just arrived, she comes from a medical thing. It's like I was thinking, like, well, when we go to the doctor, we want classical logicians and classical way of consequence. Like, you don't want the dialectistic doctor or the paraconsistic. No, this might or might not work. Yes, it will cure you, and it will not. It's like, oh, come on, man. Give me some classical logic, please. Jessica, would you like to add something to what Ole and Jonas said?
Yeah. So yeah, thanks to both of those guys for those insightful remarks. I would just distinguish between pluralism about logic as focused on some specific phenomenon or set of data or context versus pluralism allowing that different contexts could admit of different logical treatments. So Jonas was, I think, allowing for the latter, and I would also want to allow for the latter. I agree with Ola that it would be, less than fully satisfactory if we were pluralist about biology, and similarly for logic as targeting some specific phenomena or context. So I think you're both right.
Oh my God. Yes. Thank you, Jessica. Maria just made it so yokoso, Maria. Okaeri nasaimasen. You're ready for the next part of the roundtable?
Yes. Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for keeping with us after 1 hour and 10 minutes. Now we are going to move to the individual questions, which I'm going to start with Jessica. Jessica, you were mentioning a little bit about your metaphysical commitments and your background in working on this topic. So we have a question for you. Logic is often treated as a more fundamental than scientific endeavors like other sciences, either metaphysically speaking or epistemically speaking. From your perspective, how should we understand the status of logical truths vis-a-vis scientific truths? In particular, is logic best seen or understood as grounding scientific theorizing, as emerging from scientific practice, or as standing in some more complex dependence relation with other sciences, or anything different from that? So please, Jessica.
Thank you, Maria. It's nice to see you, and I hope everything is going okay. So your question, to my mind, is really a question about the metaphysics of logic, even notwithstanding that logic is about reasoning, but we can ask this question about the underlying metaphysics. So I think in order to answer it, we had first get clear about what logic is or is supposed to be, and how we want to understand in particular the notion of broadly logical validity. So as I was mentioning previously, there's, I think, at least two very different takes on validity, and with one being a notion of logic as involving constraints on worldly states of affairs, and the other understanding validity as involving constraints on belief states or mental stances. So those are going to, I think, give very different sort of, they will require different sorts of treatments from a metaphysical point of view. So if you think of logic as tracking necessary joints in nature that any science in particular must conform to, then it might be natural to think of logic as more fundamental than any of the sciences on pretty much any conception of fundamentality, right? On the other hand, if you think of logic as tracking constraints on beliefs, where those constraints might reflect diverse phenomena, epistemic limitations, or metaphysical imprecision, and so on, then you might rather see the associated logics as posterior, metaphysically posterior to or dependent on, or maybe on a par with, that's fine too, just not necessarily more fundamental than the sciences at issue. So you might think that quantum logic is dependent in some way on quantum theory. Now, you don't have to think that, of course. If you're an exceptionalist, you needn't think that, but it would be something somebody could try to push from a metaphysical point of view, with the idea being that logic is, in a sense, kind of a weakly emergent abstraction from the quantum goings-on or the quantum theorizing. So I don't have a fixed view as regards this, but I think this is one of the things I've really enjoyed about this opportunity is sort of inspiring me to think more about this question. I thought a lot about the questions of metaphysical dependence relations involving other scientific goings-on, but haven't really thought very hard at all about what about logic and logical goings-on. So, I really appreciate this opportunity to get started thinking about this. One thing that occurs to me is that, and this is something that Ole has been pressing in terms of the kind of traditional features of logic as, maximally general or universally applicable. And here I just want to flag that if you want to try to preserve the idea of logic, even in a context where you want to grant that there are many different logics applying to different contexts, but you still want to preserve that flavor of logic as somehow more general, there's two ways in which this kind of generality might be achieved. So, one conception of generality has to do with the notion of universality. So a theory is sort of, appropriately general if it applies in any context, something like that. But there's another notion of generality which is compatible with logic or logical theory being metaphysically dependent on or on a par with a given scientific or other sort of more specific theory. And that is just if the logic is a kind of abstraction from the specific goings-on that are treated by the scientific or other theory, right? So that's a form of generality. Abstraction is a kind of generality. So this kind of notion of higher level entities or features that's characteristic of weak emergence or realization relations, these higher level guys typically are more general than the lower level physical goings on, to the extent that they abstract away from the microphysical details. So if one wanted to try to make sense of logic being in some sense on a par or even metaphysically dependent on more specific and in particular scientific theories, while preserving the idea of logic as general in a way that the sciences aren't, you can do that. So I think that was something that occurred to me when I was thinking about your question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Jessica, and I am sure that our audience will come back to your ideas on this point in the Q&A. So now let's move to the next question, which is for Ole, but please remember that if you, Jessica, Ole, or Jonas have anything to say on the individual questions of somebody else, you can also say, I want to say something, I want to add something, or to object to something. So Ole, many logical systems are justified by appeal to their role in scientific reasoning, especially in cases involving inconsistency, idealization, abstraction, among other like epistemic phenomena. Do you think that scientific practice can provide any type of evidence or in favor or against particular logics? If so, what type of evidence should one seek for when looking at scientific practice? Do you think that such practices genuinely justify logical principles, or do they merely motivate their use, or they illustrate more or less how they look like in a specific context, but nothing more? Please, Ole, and again, if any of the other participants want to say something, just say it, please.
Yeah, I'm very happy that I'm invited to answer all the questions, because I was kind of jealous that Jessica got that question, but I understand that she gets it, right? Because
yes, but if you want to start with your answer on that.
I'm definitely I'm using that option of answering both questions. So Jessica was one of the first people that I encountered that talked about the connection between anti-exceptionalism and logic and metaphysics. And I haven't done a lot of metaphysics, and I'm quite terrified of metaphysics. So I've just started thinking about this, and I'm trying to write a paper about the connection between logical laws and laws of nature. And so I've been thinking about this, and I'm not going to go into that, but as a sort of segue into my own question, I just want to say that there is a sense in which we've already covered this idea that practices, scientific practice, can inform theorizing in logic, or theory selection in logic. And I think that mathematics is a clear example of this, right? But there are other examples as well, where logicians have been very interested in a particular piece of scientific reasoning in order to develop their theories. But I think another question is whether or not results established in the sciences inform logical theory choice, right? And there is a sort of very obvious sense in which it does, right? Look, if logic is in the business of providing very general truths, proofs about absolutely everything, and then in science we establish a counterexample, then it's, you know, and all bets are off, right? And of course that's not how things normally work, right? So quantum logic is kind of an exception here, because it was an attempt at connecting results in theoretical physics with theory, choice, and logic very directly, right? Not in the sense that, oh, I can see that the law through the middle fails, but in the sense that the commitments of your logical theory and the commitments of the, you know, and the theory from physics, they seem incompatible, right? Now, again, as Jessica said, we don't think that's the case anymore, but people definitely entertain this view for some time, and there are still people who try to develop these ideas. And my view is that this is in principle right. There's no preventing science from landing on theories that will challenge logical canon, today classical logic, right? Is that likely? I don't know. Maybe it's super unlikely, right? But it's important to recognize that this is what happened previously in the history. It happened several times, right? Logical people theorizing about logics had agreed on what logic looked like, and then, oh, we changed it, right? And it's kind of dramatic, right? And it maybe doesn't change in the way that you expected it to, but it does change. And I don't see any reason why that couldn't happen again. And so that gets to this particular part of the question, right? So would that point to any logic in particular? And I think my attitude to that is no. I mean, it's not like we're in a situation now where an anti-exceptionalist approach to logic gives you reason to point to a particular non-classical logic and saying that's the one. I don't think so. I think, in all honesty, although I'm a non-classical logician by training, I think, in all honesty, the reasonable assessment of the situation is that we're living inside a paradigm of classical logic, right? To use a sort of loosely Kuhnian term. Classical logic is, after all, taught as quote unquote logic at pretty much every university in the world. A textbook in logic is a textbook in classical logic, right? From within the philosophy and a certain branch of philosophy, we don't really think about it that way, right? It looks like there's a lot more disagreement. But I think if we were to say, you know, is it the case that scientific practice today points to a particular logic, it's classical logic, right? But that's why I wanted to start off by saying that, in principle, part of the framework that the anti-exceptionalist is building is a framework in which, in principle, you can get a revision of classical logic that is highly rational and then in some sense respects scientific findings, and that wouldn't be unheard of, that we change the logical principles.
Great. Let me pressure you a little bit on this, because part of the question was, what type of evidence do we get when we look at scientific practice, right? And so some of your suggestions was, well, it's not so clear which type of evidential role this thing that we get and we call evidence will play. So do you have any intuitions, maybe roles of like confirmation or reinforcement are more easily to accept than refutatory roles, or maybe it's only challenging evidence, what we tend to call evidence when we have these discussions about logic revision or theory choice? Do you have any ideas on the role that this evidence might play in the debates, more likely, or?
Yeah, I mean, I've thought a lot about this. What does evidence mean in this context, right? I mean, I even wrote a paper with the title, "What Counts as Evidence in Logic?" And, you know, I discussed quantum mechanics, and quantum logic is such an example, right? The one I mentioned before. And so why is that an interesting example from the sciences? Well, it's because it changes something very fundamental, right? It challenges a sort of metaphysical presupposition, you could say, about determinism in the world. And if you think, as some people thought, that that determinism was somehow built into our logic, well, then it looked like you had reason to be concerned about the logics as well, right? So that was a kind of connect between the findings in science and the and logical theorizing. But other than that, most of what we have as real examples are really evidence from mathematics, right? We explore mathematics, set theory, for instance, right? We have this idea that even though sometimes we say that logic is foundational to mathematics, the truth is that logic and logical theorizing typically tend to try to respect developments in mathematics, right? And if mathematical theorizing goes in one direction, then logic follows that. So that's another area where you could definitely imagine there being evidence that you later on use in an inference to best explanation or something along those lines, right? But that's not the situation we have today, right? It's a hypothetical situation. It's described, for instance, in Graham Priest's book, Doubt Truth to be a Liar, this kind of idea, again, hypothetical, that you would have a situation in arithmetic like the one that you had in geometry, where someone comes up with a non-standard geometry arithmetic, right? And oh, that's going to be inconsistent with classical logic. What do? You change classical logic in order to accommodate the new principles, right? And then that fits better with your scientific practice or something. Yeah. So maybe this is a little bit of a non answer. But the final thing I wanted to say, and I won't go into details, but in that paper that I wrote, another thing that I mentioned as a kind of evidential source is indispensability, right? So if you could argue the logical principle is indispensable for scientific theorizing, then maybe that's the best evidence you can get for that principle. And of course, that's a kind of move that's known from philosophy of mathematics, together with a whole host of objections to indispensability arguments. But if those are okay for mathematics, I think clearly they're okay for logic as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Ole. Let's move to Jonas' question. And again, if any of the other two panelists wants to add something to the question or to the answer, just raise your hand and we'll see you and then you can speak. So, Jonas, in several scientific disciplines, successful reasoning occurs in the presence of defects like inconsistency or uncertainty or ontological indeterminacy, among others. What do you think these cases can tell us about the claim of the nature of logic? And what about its applicability? Do they suggest revising our conception of logic itself, or rather revising how we think logic applies within scientific context, or something different? What do you think?
Sorry, I'm not sure that
I think, Jonas, that your internet connection is very weak. Why don't you lose your camera? Maybe that helps.
Question before with me or not? You hear me?
Now we hear you well. Can you repeat what you were saying, please?
You hear me, Maria?
Yes. Jonas, can you repeat what you were saying, please?
I was saying that I think that maybe Gabrielle made the individual question for me already in the beginning of this individual session.
Okay, so let me press you then in.
Gabrielle has already made the individual question for me. That is what I was trying to say.
Perfect. So let me press you a little bit more on your work. Do you think that when you are applying this particular type of non-classical logics to very foundational problems in science, should that tell us something about the status of these logics, or just give us some methodological tools to analyze very complex scientific scenarios?
Good. Thanks a lot, Maria. Do you listen to me well now?
Yes, we can listen to you.
Good, thank you. Well, I would think that Uli gave an indication on that one already. When he mentioned that the issue of having a change in logic that made a real difference happened already in the case of mathematics. So in the case of mathematics, we do had an important episode where logic was really changed, or the change of logic changed everything.
Jonas, we are losing you and we cannot understand what you are saying.
Suggest give rise to temporary approach to mathematics, and things are more or less settled. So even if we come up with like consistent arithmetics, we wouldn't say that the logic of arithmetic has changed. We would say that we have a different arithmetic.
So what we are going to do with Jonas is he's going to go. I think he said in the chat that he will try to fix his connection. So maybe Ole or Jessica want to assess this question meanwhile. He seems to be joining back again the session, so it may take a couple of minutes. So Ole, Jessica, do you want to say something about what it means, the applicability of these very special or very particular logics in more fundamental discussions in science? Do you have a take on what should be the commitments that one has towards these logics or towards the problems? Maybe they are very, very open problems, we still have to understand much more about the domain in order to make an actual claim about the logic or the legitimacy of any logic when talking about those particular topics in science. Do you have any take on this, Jessica or Ole?
I think I have already sort of come out as being in favor of thinking of the attention to scientific context where, for example, we're operating under conditions of uncertainty or imprecision in our measurements, et cetera. I think those are important contexts that can inform, probably that should inform our understanding of valid reasoning, broadly valid reasoning. And I said earlier that I don't think, however, that that commitment in itself will legislate the dispute between the exceptionalist versus the anti-exceptionalist, since the exceptionalist has resources for presumably hypothetically considering what logical systems would or could be like, and they will understand the phenomena that are at issue as cases of application of logical theories that they have been able to independently formulate, right? Whereas the anti-exceptionalist may or may not think of these cases of diverse scientific contexts involving epistemic limitations, measurement, imprecision, and the like as perhaps inspiring the formulation of new logical theories and so on. So I think in either way, wherever you fall as regards this dispute, you can take seriously attention to these practices, scientific practices, and so on. So that's why I think it's important. And in fact, just to follow up, because this is going to basically be what I say at the end when you're going to ask, we could summarize in one or two sentences the importance of seeing logic and science together. I don't want to repeat myself again, but I'll just say what I wanted to say there was that you can't do good science without having some understanding of what counts as good or valid reasoning. But on the other hand, a sufficiently general understanding of what counts as good or valid reasoning should be able to make sense of such reasoning one way or the other, right, as it shows up in diverse scientific contexts where these epistemic limitations may be salient or there's novel metaphysical features of reality that we need to accommodate and so on. So I think of logic as a crucial tool for science, but science itself either, and here it's important to realize you can do hypothetical science as well. So, right, both the exceptionalists and the anti-exceptionalists can hypothetically do hypothetical theorizing in their with their preferred mode of inference. But I think so science, both actual and hypothetical, may reveal the need for new logical tools. So
let me press you a little bit on that. Do you think
Okay.
there is a better type of science that can actually inform us as philosophers of logic about which are the actual practices that deserve some commitment in the realm of logic? Or any practice in logic can be, any practice in science can be a good target for choosing the applicability of certain logics?
Maria, someone is at my door.
Yeah, sure.
Just 1 second.
Yeah,
Sorry.
Let's move to Jonas. Jonas is back, so let's go back to Jonas.
Thank you, Maria, and apologies to you all because it was the technical problem. Now I'm back. So yes, what I was saying, I'll be quick. was I would like to go back to Ule's claim that we have already had an interesting episode of changing logic in the case of mathematics. And I would say that the case of mathematics is interesting because the rise of classical mathematics, instead, I would say, of codifying the inferences mathematicians do, it set a new standard of rigor for mathematics, a kind of ideal standard, according to which their practice is more or less measured. So even though they don't use classical logic, they are sort of measured according to it. And in the case of non-standard mathematics, whenever we find, if we find that arithmetic, for instance, has an inconsistency, then we can try to make like a paraconsistent mathematics. And that would be just another arithmetics instead of a logical revision. I would say that it just happens to arithmetic. It would happen as it happened to geometry. Now, you were more concerned, of course, in the case of empirical sciences and physics. And in this case, as I was mentioning, we can, of course, use these situations where inconsistencies appear to apply our logical tools and skills to model those situations and provide logical theorizing. But I'm not sure that this would easily lead to a kind of logical revision in science, empirical science, because empirical scientists often think of inconsistencies and incoherencies or lack of determinacy as situations where we need more science, right? So if you say that, well, quantum mechanics and general relativity are incompatible, and a logician comes to them and say, look, just use paraconsistent logic and everything is settled. They say, no, we need more physics, right? Not more logic. And this would happen also to the paradigmatic cases of the early calculus, where you have infinitesimals that were turned consistent, Bohr's model of the atom. So if you could go back in time and say, look, a new logic will rise where all these difficulties will be like somehow solved in a logical way, they'll say, no, we need physical understanding, we need more physics, and that's an issue for physics. So in this sense, I'm not saying that it is impossible that different logics will be useful for science. I'm saying that in general, the empirical sciences are more resistant, and from a methodological point of view, they require that physical problems be dealt with more physics instead of more logics. So there's a difference in mathematics and in empirical science on the way you treat this. If you do paraconsistent mathematics, this is more mathematics. If you do paraconsistent physics, you say, well, this is a weird physics. So there's a difference in those things. And from a logical point of view, you can really develop all kinds of systems to cope with the situation. But institutionally, from the point of view of physicists, they will certainly want more physics instead of different logics. So I'm not saying that there is a matter of the question that could solve this. It is really a paradigmatic problem. Maybe in the future, physicists decide, well, we should go paraconsistent and unify quantum mechanics and the theory of relativity using paraconsistent logic. Who knows?
Probably not. But
yeah, exactly. Just don't believe it.
Thank you, Jonas. Jessica, Ole, do you want to add anything to this question? If not, we can move
I
to
just
the final
wanted to just follow up with another case of the physicists resisting movement to a new logic. For example, I think in quantum mechanics, the concern that if there were to be genuine quantum metaphysical indeterminacy, then you would have to endorse a new logic and so on, struck at least some physicists as sufficiently problematic that they devoted, as at least one of the motivations for example, Everettian interpretation of quantum mechanics, which will replace indeterminacy with multiplicity, such that you can just stick with your same old logic. So I do think there's a certain degree of conservatism that's associated, that the physicists manifest, but luckily we're not physicists.
Thank you, Jessica. Ole, do you want to say anything on this topic?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say something about this. I certainly agree that there's a conservativeness is a kind of virtue of or criteria of theory selection here, right? And I mean, that's not a bad thing, right? We're trying to save useful parts of our theories, even in the face of new information, and that's a very, very standard reaction in the sciences, right? You have a piece of mathematics, a model, it really works. Then you realize that it doesn't work for some other related phenomena. Well, then you generalize it, right? And then maybe you can preserve the old structure as a limit case, for instance, right? That's an elegant solution. And in logic, you see similar kind of things, right? You try to preserve classical logic as a limit case in a number of non-classical logics. And then the non-classical logicians will say, no, we still preserve what was good about classical logic, but we've now generalized in order to accommodate these other phenomena as well. But then about inconsistent arithmetic, and I think I agree with Jonas that there is a sense in which anything can be new mathematics, right? We'll just take all comers. You give me your favorite logical theory, right? And we'll add it to the books and we'll study it and we'll learn things, right? No one disagrees about that. But I think there's still a lesson learned from some of the history of logic, where we really did think in a sort of colloquial sense that syllogistic theory of logic was correct. And we didn't realize, and we hadn't imagined that it was deficient because there were modes of reasoning clearly acceptable and applied that it didn't actually allow us to codify. And we're in the same situation in the sense that, well, now we have a new codification. And as Jonas said, it's a new standard of rigor that we teach and we believe in. But with a little bit of humility, I think it's fair to say that we might be looking back at this 500 years from now and going, wow, boy, classical logic really hung on to that for a long time, right? But now it looks kind of dated. And so from that perspective, I think maybe the example of geometries is more interesting, right? And this is Graham Priest's point as well, that, well, in that case, we did tinker with the mathematics and we came up with all of these non-Euclidean geometries, and it was great fun. And then, suddenly they became applicable to things we cared about in physics, right? And then the question is there a distinction here between it being good mathematics, and all these theories are good mathematics, right? And it being good logics in a sense, right? And the logic being correct for some phenomenon or other, right? And here, I think Jonas and I would disagree a little bit, but maybe not as much as it might appear, right? Because I agree that, as you said earlier, validity, that's a technical term, right? And validity can mean a lot of different things depending on the theory. But logics are also about truth, right? And I'm not sure I think truth can be a lot of different things, right? Yeah, truth in a model, like designated value, but not truth in the sense that the law of excluded middle is true of all properties and objects, right? And as we go along and we explore the world and we find out more about the properties and objects, that principle is just as open in principle to revision as more special science principles about specific sets of properties and objects. And on that kind of framework for logic, and this is just part of the story, obviously, right? Validity doesn't even really enter into the picture, right? It's open to the logicians to define what validity means in one theory or the other, but the exploration of truth, and maybe necessary truth, is still a kind of worldly matter.
Perfect. And taking advantage that you have your mic open, can you give us one or two sentences that you would use to defend the importance of seeing logic and science together? What would you say?
Logic is science, That's one sentence. I'm just seeing if I have another one. Jessica put it so beautifully before, so I feel like whatever I say now, I can't really do better than that. Yeah, logic is science. The plurality of methods of the special sciences should inform how we do logic. I'll let that be the second sentence.
Great. Jonas, one or two sentences that you would use to describe the relation or the importance of being logic and science together.
Well, I agree with Uli, and I hope this is not counting as one science. That Jessica has made some nice, put it very nicely, and I wish I could have
two sentences nice already.
But yes, logic is science, and I think that makes logic more flexible than we used to think about it. So in a sense, I would like to say that if we could go even closer to science, I think we could drop some important philosophical problems that are on the way and see them as less central a concern as we are now treating them. For instance, I would say logical theory choice. I think it is taken as too central a problem, and it shouldn't. Okay, I went too far.
Thank you, Jonas. Now we are going to move to the Q&A, and people from the Zoom meeting, you can raise your hand in reactions and raise your hand, and we can open your mic so you can ask the question. But meanwhile, and people from YouTube, you can type your question in the chat box, and we're going to read it out loud here. So meanwhile, Alejandro Estrada has a question for you. I think for any of you that you want to answer. And his question concerns logical pluralism and the application of logic in scientific context. The question particularly is it possible to think that there is one correct logic for physics, another for mathematics, another for biology, chemistry, and so on, maybe for individual problems as well? And these logics might be distinct from one another, and that's okay. But can there be more than one correct logic to be applied in the same context? For example, two correct rival logics for biology, or two correct rival logics for chemistry, and so on and so forth. So any of you that want to answer, please. Ollie.
Yeah, I can start. I mean, if the question is meant as a sort of, is this something that we can consider? Yes, and we do consider it. And I think a lot of people hold the view that there are different logics for different contexts, right? So for instance, there's a logic for mathematics, but that's different from the logic of, say, normative reasoning or something along those lines. Do I agree with that position? No, I'm not sure I agree with that. And then the second question, could there be two different logics, so irreducible and incompatible for the same area, same subject matter? Yeah, and I think there is a sense in which that's really the interesting logical pluralism, right? Where logical pluralism is supposed to suggest that logic is different from other kinds of theories, because you can have two theories and there is no fact of the matter as to whether or not one is correct. That's a very radical view, right? And as I said earlier, to one of the questions, I think if you're an anti-exceptionalist, that would be a reason to see logic is very different from other sciences, unless you are really a pluralist about other sciences as well, or at least some of them, right? And some people are, but I take that to be a minority view for sure.
Thank you, Ole. Jessica, Jonas, do you want to say something on this topic?
I just basically agree with Ole, and yeah, I would have to see, maybe this is because I'm also kind of conservative about the extent to which logic would depart from just ordinary investigations, especially if we're thinking of logic as a science. we would need some reason to think that there was some, one target that admitted of, incompatible and irreducible logical theories. So I don't know of a case. Maybe there is one, and I just don't know about it. But, I think we need some motivation to go there.
Thank you. Jonas, do you want to say something on this question? Do you want to move to the next one?
Yeah, I'll quickly add that there's already the first kind of pluralism, as Uli mentioned. So we have already classical logic for classical mathematics and intuitionistic logic for intuitionistic mathematics. So we do have different logics applying different fields. And whether there are different logics incompatible with one another applying to the same field, I'm not sure, but probably yes. So if you think about like some paraconsistent logics that form a whole family, disagreeing on some details that are very far away from what reasoners would actually apply, you could have these logics being sort of correct or useful for some contexts and still disagreeing on some parts that are very far from the practice. I'm not sure about this, but this could probably be the case.
Thank you very much. So now we have two questions from the Zoom meeting, but I think we have a technical problem. We can ask to unmute.
Now they can, Maria.
Okay.
Now
perfect.
they can
Thank
open
you.
their.
Thank you
their
very
mic.
much. So,
¿Ya me entendiste? Que ya pueden abrir sus micrófonos ellos
sure.
solos. Ajá.
So, Mike Moreira,
Yes.
you can also open your camera, I think, if you want, and please ask your question.
Just a second. I can't.
Okay, we'll work on that, but start with your question meanwhile, please. Thank you.
Okay. So my question is focused on in the relationship between logic and mathematics and empirical science. If we have several different logics which can give rise to different mathematics, and those different mathematics can apply to empirical science, do we have some constraints in this relation? I mean, we have classical mathematics and intuitionist mathematics. Intuitionistic mathematics is usually more related to computational problems and things like that. And classical mathematics is widely used in physics, chemistry, and other areas. So paraconsistent logic and paraconsistent mathematics could have something similar to these.
You are muted?
Oh, yes, I finished up my question.
Thank you very much. So any of the panelists, Jessica, Ole, or Jonas, do you want to answer to this question?
May I say something quickly?
Yes, thank you, Jonas.
Thank you for the question. I think that as Uli mentioned before, regarding the indispensability argument, probably in the sciences, there is a case that all of the mathematics required is in general classical mathematics. So all we need is classical logic. So in that sense, it is not even clear, or it's not clear at least, that like other logics, like intuitionistic logics, will be available, we'll be able to deliver the mathematics we need to develop our scientific theories. So in that sense, having different branches of science and having different mathematics is not really offering this kind of situation, basically because empirical science uses mostly classical mathematics. And of course, whenever some kind of constructive mathematics can deal with science, that's because it recovers the classical results that are required in classical mathematics. So in that sense, there's, at least as so far, not much of a problem in this scenario. And those different logics are not really applied to develop the mathematics underlying those theories, I think, but rather to codify specific inference patterns that are exemplified in those theories, which are different things. So that's what I would like to say about it.
Can I
Thank you,
add something as
Jonas.
well?
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I just following up on what Jonas was saying, I think there is a sense in which if you're taking on board a non-classical logic, not as a mere kind of complement, a piece of additional mathematics to do something with, but as a genuine rival to classical logic, then a lot of philosophers think of this as coming with a challenge to show that the non-classical logic can deliver classical mathematics. And if it can't do that, you have a problem. What does that mean exactly, right? Well, it means, how much arithmetic, set theory can you do with this mathematics, with this logic, sorry. And unfortunately, the dialectic there tends to be, it's an issue that the non-classical logics are deductively weaker. But it misses an important point, which is that the whole rationale for weakening classical logic to a subclassical logic is so that you can add, concepts and theory that you couldn't add to the classical logic consistently. And so in that sense, often these theories are incomparable. But nonetheless, if you couldn't show that you could preserve classical mathematics in some sense, that's usually considered an issue.
Perfect. Thank you very much. If it is okay with you, let's move to the second question in the Zoom meeting, which is from Eric Wallace. Eric, you can open your mic and your camera if you want and ask your question, please. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Is my camera working? Oh, my camera appears to be. There we go.
Yeah,
Thank you very
it's
much. So I've got a question for the panel about what exactly you think that anti-exceptionalism amounts to. So there are various kind of traditional pieces of the traditional picture of logic as a priori, necessary, analytic, and so on, topic neutral. I'm wondering how much of that tradition needs to be rejected before we consider ourselves to have given an anti-exceptionalist view. So what made me think of this is if Jessica is suggesting that we might be anti-exceptionalist, have an abductive view of logic, and yet still consider the epistemology to be a priori. I'm wondering, is the key thing to reject here just a kind of notion of rational intuition, to take on an abductive epistemology that is similar to the natural and social sciences, in which case I'm maybe wondering, why aren't we just calling the position abductivism about logic? So yes, is it, when we're talking about anti-exceptionalism here, do we really just mean abductivism, or is there another piece of the picture that just hasn't come up today?
I think I have to say something about this. Is that okay? I feel
Sure.
like I'm to be blamed for some of the misunderstandings here as well. So, yeah, it's difficult, right? Anti-exceptionalism is a label, right? And if you were asking questions about, say, anti-realism or instead, right, it's a little bit. There's a lot of moving pieces here, and people use the jargon a little bit differently. So the way that I originally described it, at least in my initial writings, was something like a continuity claim, right? A continuity between the methodology of sciences and the methodology of logic. And then later on, I wrote this paper with Ben Martin about rejecting traditional properties, and there we suggested that it was really more about that. And then you asked this very good question, Eric. Well, do you have to reject all of them, right? And I don't think so, right? Because most anti-exceptionalists that I know are universalists. They do think logics apply universally. They don't give up on that. And I think the key one, and Jessica has already mentioned this, right? The key one is that I early on thought that rejecting the a priori status of logical knowledge was absolutely key, right? And then very quickly I realized that, oh, people who do think of themselves as broadly anti-exceptionalist don't agree with that, right? And for the following reason, right? You can be an abductivist, but think that some of the sources of evidence is a priori sources, right? But it doesn't mean that you can directly a priori, wholly a priori, justify an individual logical principle, right? It goes via theory selection in the way that I think about it. And then there's the final point about abductivism. And I think that's a little bit of a different question, because regardless of all of this, like which properties is it really? I think that abductive argument is just one contender here, right? So Ben Martin and I wrote about this proposal that we call predictivism. That's a kind of borrowing some machinery from the philosophy of science to come up with a different methodology. And then there's reflective equilibrium, and there are theories, you know, in that ballpark. They're also anti-exceptionalist in some sense. But they're not realist, right? And so Evelyn is here in the audience, I think, and she wrote a dissertation about this. That's really great, and there are other people writing about reflective, anti-realist, anti-exceptionalist proposals, right? That challenge the subductivist doctrine. Yeah, I mean that was part of an answer anyway. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ole. Jessica or Jonas, do you want to add anything? Jessica, please.
Yeah, I could. I think, yeah, this is a good question, and it's a question that I tried to answer once I realized that one could make out that abduction is an a priori mode of inference. So the question is then, how should you characterize the exceptionalist versus anti-exceptionalist debate? And I considered, Stephen Biggs and I considered some, other ways of characterizing the debate. We, like, does the exceptionalist think that the data that the mode of inference operates on is always a priori, whereas the anti-exceptionalist thinks that it is always a posteriori, but then that mischaracterizes some anti-exceptionalists, like Priest, for example, or Joe Russell in some of her discussions. So what we ended up saying is that really we do go kind of through a list, so with ideas that the exceptionalists will maintain that the justification of logical theories proceeds by way of something like conceiving, rational intuition, conceptual analysis, operating on a priori data, hence is always a priori, with respect both to the mode of inference that enters into the justification of the theory and the data that mode of inference operates on, whereas the anti-exceptionalist maintains that the justification proceeds by way of abduction, hence will be either a priori or a posteriori, depending on the status of the data. That was my attempt to characterize it.
Thank you, Jessica. Jonas, do you want to add something?
Yes, very quickly. I would like to add that if we take this view of anti-exceptionalism as continuity with science, we still have a wide field to determine what anti-exceptionalist means by deciding what kind of science how we are understanding science. So there is a lot of space to see that science also has a priori elements, and in this sense, the logic as continuity with science does not rule out some of the traditional features of logic, because it depends very much on how you will frame your understanding of science. So that's a very good question and very difficult, because a lot of places to fix the concept.
Thank you, Jonas. Thank you, everybody. Let me read to you a question from YouTube. So this is coming from Rika Sus, and she says, I have a question on philosophical logics. For example, logics of grounding. Should they be addressed differently from more traditional logical systems, especially when it comes to anti-exceptionalism about logical line of inquiry? Do you think they are continuous with the sciences in the same sense of more standard logical theories? I guess the first person to answer this question is Jessica. So Jessica, please.
Yeah, thanks for that question. This is a really interesting question, in part because there's a kind of presupposition in attempts to offer a logic of grounding, namely that the phenomena itself is unified in a way that admits of this kind of formal treatment. And one of the complaints I have about the introduction of the notion of grounding as itself a kind of primitive relation or relations that is operative in any of these contexts where one or some goings-on metaphysically depend on some others, is that it is such as to inappropriately restrict, what kinds of metaphysical dependence relations are at issue in these various contexts. So I don't like the idea of a logic of grounding on those grounds. That said, I don't object to the attempt to identify one or more logics of metaphysical dependence relations that go beyond, say, just the logic of, for example, the determinable-determinant relation or set theory or whatever might be the case. So if there were ways of systematizing reasoning involving these dependence relations, I do think that would be consonant with, being thought of as a logic proper that, again, as we've been saying, might only be applicable in certain contexts, but nonetheless important contexts.
Great. Thank you, Jessica. Jonas, Ole, do you want to add something? If not, we can move to the next question.
Yeah,
Jonas.
I could only recommend Jessica's paper on grounding, which I like very much, and I agree. Very, very, very good papers.
Thank you so much.
Great. If not, I think I have a question for Ole related to your comment about methodological anti-exceptionalism, abductivism, and predictivism. So this is coming from Facebook, and it says, anti-exceptionalist approaches often frame the methodology of logic in terms of a choice between general scientific strategies, most prominently abductivism or predictivism. Do you think this way of setting up the debate is already mistaken at the more basic level? In particular, does it overlook the fact that scientific methodology itself is very much plural, context-sensitive, and domain-dependent, rather than governed by a single general methodological template that logic could straightforwardly inherit? Ole, please.
Well, I'm going to try to answer this without contradicting myself. So on the one hand, I have to say that I defended predictivism in a paper, so I think there is something to that framework. But I just want to make sure that that's not confused with the view that any science has some kind of hallmark methodology that unifies it into science with a capital S. So I think that idea is very problematic. And I think the way most anti-exceptionalists have approached this is just to sort of grab hold of whatever looks promising in other sciences and try that out on logic without thinking that there is some kind of really general methodology. So to put it perhaps a little bit simpler, anti-exceptionalism is compatible with the view that all we have are special sciences, logic being one of them, and they're all methodologically different from each other, right? So yeah, and so maybe that should lead you to the more radical conclusion that both abductivism and predictivism fails because something else is going on in logic, and that's what really what we should pay attention to. And sure, I'm open to that. I think the only thing that we, and I mean Ben Martin and I wrote some of these papers on about predictivism in particular. What we were thinking about was coming up with methodology that kept it at least open what the evidence for and against logical theories is supposed to be, right? So a methodology or a set of methods that's such that it can be endorsed by people with different views about what counts as evidence for logic. So plural, at least in that sense. But anyway, that's trying to take this, even though I am a predictivist, concede a little bit.
Thank you very much, Ole. Jessica or Jonas, do you want to add anything to this question about methodological pluralism in science and maybe not so much pluralism, methodologically speaking, in logic? If not, we can move to the last question, which is going to be from the Zoom meeting. So Santiago, can you please open your mic and your camera and just ask your question? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it clear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. I just have a question. I wrote it down. It says this. Does it make sense to say that it is possible to naturalize the logics in the Quinian sense? If so, how could we do so, and how would this approach to logics differ from other approaches? Where can I investigate further? Well, my idea with this question is to understand and maybe investigate if logic can formalize, the process of scientific thought without falling into the inconsistencies of pluralism. I don't know if this makes any sense, but I would appreciate some feedback on this.
Thank you, Santiago. Any of you want to answer? Ole, Jessica, Jonas?
Yeah, I mean, about the first part, you said naturalize, right? Naturalize logic. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think one way of thinking about anti-exceptionalism is that it's trying to do exactly that, right? It's looking at a tradition of logic where the epistemologies of logic or the accounts about how we've acquired knowledge about logic have seemed mysterious, right? Or at least not working by the same standards as the empirical sciences, now broadly construed. And then you have a lot of options for doing that. But then because naturalize is very close to naturalism, right? There is the danger here of going a little bit too far to the kind of the view of logic that Quine had, at least in True Dogmas of Empiricism, where you think that logic is really continuous, not only with sciences broadly speaking, but with the hard sciences and physics in particular, right? And then the only kind of logical revision that you can envisage there is you get empirical data, you change your best scientific theories, and thereby you might have to change your logic, right? So that you can think of that as kind of Quine's idea of naturalizing logic. And I think there's a lot of Ben and I spend a lot of time making sure that people don't confuse naturalism with anti-exceptionalism, because anti-exceptionalism probably includes naturalism, but it includes a lot of other things, right? And so this stuff about a priori evidence is precisely one of the reasons why that's important to to underline, right? That's a broader position. So I guess that I'm not really answering your question, except saying it depends a little bit on what you mean by naturalize here, right? If you mean bringing logic closer to the sciences, then yes, anti-exceptionalism is motivated by that project. But if you mean, making it naturalistically acceptable, then that's going to take a little bit more.
Thank you very much, Ole. Jessica, Jonas, do you want to add anything on this question? Jessica, please.
I just wanted to register that I think our discussion today has really made even more clear to me than it was before, that how one thinks about the notion of validity that's at issue, or the notions of validity, is going to make a lot of difference to how one comes down on some of these issues. So again, I think, there's this question about whether logic is supposed to be, and logic validity is supposed to be, tracking or encoding some kinds of worldly joints, which are in some sense maximally universal and so on, or maybe we move back off on that, but still worldly in something like the way the special sciences are, still tracking relations between truths or worldly states of affairs, or thinking of logic as the science of reasoning, as engaged in by creatures like us who are typically not in position to know what is true. Of course, we can, speculate or hypothesize, the suppositional reasoning and so on. But again, there's forms of reasoning that we want to be able to engage in and understand, where we are decidedly not talking about preservation or necessary preservation of truth. So it just seems to me that it's an underappreciated option, and I want to kind of advertise that, I think I would like to, maybe some of us should be thinking, not so willing to think about logic on the model quite of the sciences as attempting to encode laws, worldly laws, or describe worldly phenomena, however general, but rather also, or maybe in addition, about creatures like us and what we think or should think is good reasoning.
Thank you very much, Jessica. Jonas, do you want to add anything to this point, please?
Very quickly, I think I agree with Uli. So there are already some programs that are naturalizing logic, like Quines, and also we should mention Penelope Medis. So they are considered as part of anti-exceptionalism in a sense. And I don't see any opposition between the two programs, but as Uli mentioned, naturalism is one of the possibilities for the anti-exceptionalists. I tend to agree.
All right, thank you. Thank you all for your feedback. That's helpful.
Thank you everybody for staying with us more than 2 hours, almost 2 hours and a half. Thank you to Ole, Jonas, and Jessica for extending your time with us. And this was a wonderful roundtable, and I'm sure that people are going to love watching it when years pass. And again, this was very insightful. Many thanks to the three of you for accepting being part of this activity. We in Lógica MX, we are very happy to have you. We have been thinking about you three for a while, about how to invite you, and it was a perfect roundtable. So thank you very much. And thank you everybody who is watching us in the present and in the future. And we are looking forward to new opportunities to have you three in another version of the activities of Lógica MX. Thanks, everybody. Now we are going to stop broadcasting. Gabrielle, can you stop the broadcast?
Yes, I can. Muchas gracias a todos. Y pues nada, sigan con la programación de Lógica MX. Termino la transmisión.